Welcome to Next Round with the Pacific Research Institute. I'm your host, Rowena Ichon. In this podcast, Tim Anaya, PRI's Director of Communications, and I chat with Keli'i Akina, President of the Grassroot Institute in Hawaii. Besides sunshine and palm trees, California and Hawaii have something in common: one-party rule. As Dr. Akina says in the interview, Hawaii is as blue as the ocean that surrounds it. Join us as we chat about our common issues: affordable housing, pension crisis, poverty, and the high cost of living in both our states. Thanks for joining us. Aloha, Dr. Keli'i Akina. Welcome to PRI's Next Round podcast.
Well, delighted to be here today with you and Tim. Looking forward to a great conversation.
We're so happy to have you on to talk about some issues that impact the residents of both our states. Like California, Hawaii is a one-party state strongly dominated by Democrats. If California Republicans actually thought things were tough here, they ought to look to Hawaii. Just how difficult is it to advocate for free market ideas facing such long odds out there in Hawaii? What kind of reaction do you get from elected officials and policymakers? And what advice do you have for those of us free marketeers out here in California trying to advance free market policies?
Well, Rowena, let me go back to what you started off with. Hawaii, like California, is a virtually one-party state. And that, regardless of what that party is, that's always going to be a problem because by the very nature of being a one-party state, it lacks competition. So if you lack competition at the political realm, you're definitely not going to get it in the economic realm. And I think that's something we've got to realize. The problem is not the Democrats. In fact, Democrats actually, in their own individual positions, span the full spectrum of positions from pro-free market to anti-free market. The problem is the preponderance of just one way of thinking. And without competition at the political level, as I said before, we're not going to get it on the economic level. I think that Hawaii, being as blue as the ocean is out here, is a great lesson for the rest of the nation. We have a Democrat governor, a Democrat House of Representatives, a Democrat state Senate. In fact, in our state Senate, there's only one Republican member. Can you believe that? And the unions are very dominant here in the labor market. They have a monopoly in every major area from education on to government services. They're run by Democrats. The school system is run by Democrats. And in the midst of this ocean, I get solace when I think about my days when I was teaching in China at Beijing University. The head of the Marxist philosophy department at a neighboring university, the People's Republic University, looked to me and he said, "Keli'i, how do you manage to live in Hawaii, which is a one-party government?" And he should know. But, we talked about that a little bit, and let me wrap up that point with this. He pointed out to me that the Chinese Communist Party has become so dominant that it fractures. It has fractured into different coalitions that are seeking reform. And that's the hope we have. The hope we have is that even amongst Democrats, you will find people who have the capability of coming up with good ideas and endorsing those good ideas. And they have their own power structures within the party. And we try to exploit those as much as possible.
We see that in California, too. And it may not work out neatly across the board, but on issue to issue, you see quote unquote moderate Democrats. Someone might be a moderate, say, on education reform issues, but they're very liberal on union issues or business and taxes. And someone who might be a moderate on environmental policy, may be very liberal on education issues. So I think that observation is a wise one in these states that are trending toward, more one-party rule.
And if I could add one thing, the predominantly Democrat population of Hawaii is not Democrat because they've looked at Democrat policies and said, we want those policies. They're Democrat out of a kind of a religious sense. They've inherited their big D as part of the culture they live within, as part of their family, and part of the fact that they've been in the unions and all of that. And so there's good news. The good news is that when they actually come in contact with real issues like homelessness or the cost of living or the skyrocketing prices of houses and so forth, they're able to see the right solution very readily. So if we can peel off the religious label, I call it, which is the party label, label. And if we don't go forward with our own labels, whether they're R or L, and simply stick to the issues, you will find that the majority of people in Hawaii will agree we should stop homelessness, that we should bring the cost of housing down, that we should pay lower taxes, that we should leave businesses alone to run themselves without government interference. And before you know it, if you're just talking about the issues and bringing the issues to them by educating them, they're espousing the same principles that those of us who promote the free market do, but don't use the word free market in the process.
You know, one of those issues, and one issue that we focus on here at PRI, is California's high state tax burden and costly regulations and the very expensive cost of living put in place by poor state policies that are really driving businesses and people away from the Golden State. Well, in preparing for our interview today, I was looking through your website, and you have this great series highlighting folks who've left for the mainland called Why We Left Hawaii, that really focuses on the various reasons why locals are deciding to leave the beautiful weather and the blue seas behind. So maybe you could paint a picture for our listeners. Just how expensive are things in Hawaii, and how much of it do you attribute to anti-free market, big government policies imposed there?
Well, Hawaii is one of the most expensive states in the nation. In fact, when you do the chart of how much a dollar can buy, Hawaii is number 50, and we lose at least 15 to 20 cents on every dollar, which makes a gallon of milk, for example, cost $6. And this problem is so bad that in the period between 2015 and 18, just 3 years, 35,000 residents of Hawaii left. Now, that may not be a lot for California, but when you have a small population of 1.3 million people here, that's a huge part of the population. We have one of the highest per capita rates of people leaving our state because they can't afford it. And I could quote you statistic after statistic that ranks Hawaii in terms of cost of living down in 45th place or 46th place and so forth. We have high taxes. We have regulatory burdens that the government imposes. You know all about this in California. Just amplify them a little bit and they drive the cost of housing up. Probably the biggest factor that drives the cost of housing up is the artificial scarcity of land. And people might be surprised when I say artificial, but it is. Some people think that there's just not enough land here to build houses. But the truth is there's more than enough land for houses and for apartments and for urban development, and still to leave the beautiful, pristine inner areas of the islands and the beaches clear. But why is it, if there's enough land, it's not available? The burden of regulation, the land use laws, the zoning laws. You'd be stunned if I told you this, that in the state of Hawaii, only 5% of the land is zoned for and support urban development and housing. Only 5%. 95% of all the land is pretty clear. It's either set aside for nature preserve or for agriculture. And the majority of the agricultural land is lying fallow. So we do this thought experiment. If you just increase the amount of land that you allow building on by 1%, you would take that 5% and boost it to a net 20% increase in supply. Do the math here, supply and demand. Increase the supply of land, you can bring the cost down. But the way people have reacted to this is just by leaving the state. They can't afford to stay here. Let me close this comment with a quote from a gentleman named Jeffrey Chun who decided to move to Nevada. And in our series on the website of grassrootinstitute.org, we feature his story, and he says, "We miss the islands, our family and friends. We don't miss the politicians, high cost of living, insane taxes, and unfriendly government towards small businesses. Those are the reasons he left."
Poverty and homelessness are also big issues in both of our states. You've written and lectured extensively about the Hawaii state government's efforts to try and lift people out of poverty, which is essentially just imposing a much higher minimum wage. You've argued that raising the minimum wage is the wrong tool for reducing poverty and may hurt those who are struggling to make ends meet. Tell us about Hawaii's poverty problem and your thoughts on how Hawaii can best help people move up the economic ladder.
Well, you raise a very important point, which is the dark side of Hawaii. Visitors come here and they see the beautiful ocean and sky and the wonderful people who work in the hotels and so forth. But at night, the residents here face the problem of poverty. In fact, Hawaii has the highest per capita rate of poverty in the nation. The number of homeless in Hawaii currently has topped 7,000 that we can count. There are far more, but for a small population, that's really, really huge. Now, there have been multiple attempts by the state government to solve the problem, but sorry to say, they basically provide food, clothing, shelter on the streets and try to move the poor and the homeless around to get them out of the sight of tourists. And it's just not working. So every legislative session, we have people who come up with the brilliant idea, let's raise the minimum wage. And I probably don't need to let your listeners know that that's not a great idea. The majority of studies on the minimum wage have shown that when you force businesses to raise what they pay, you end up causing many of them to lay off workers or to reduce their hours. So the net result of increasing the minimum wage, studies show, is actually that it hurts the very people whom it's designed to help. But you did mention minimum wage, which is often looked to as the potential solution, but that's really not the way to solve the problem. We can't raise the minimum wage high enough to really help people. Give them $15 an hour or $20. You still couldn't afford to live in Hawaii. $30 an hour would still not get you enough to live in Hawaii. That's because the cost of living is so high. So what we recommend and think is a far better solution, rather than force businesses to raise the minimum wage, let's use government policy to bring down the cost of living. Let's have rational housing policies that open up more land for development so that we can increase the supply and bring the cost of housing down. Let's reform our shipping laws, known as the Jones Act, which we might talk about today later on, and let's bring the cost of shipping goods and materials to Hawaii down. Let's reduce the tax burden. And so at the Grassroot Institute, what we do is come up with a list of several things that can be done readily by any politician, Democrat, Republican, or Libertarian, and they will result in a reduction of the cost of living. You know, to help the poor, it's like to raise the water level of one boat, you need to raise the level of water for all boats. And by reducing the cost of living, you help everybody.
It seems like the battle over government-run healthcare is not exclusive to California, that you have a fight on your hands in Hawaii as well. And we've seen that the Grassroot Institute has done expensive research and analysis on Hawaii's ongoing doctor shortage. And you're seeing that many medical professionals are choosing to leave Hawaii rather than see patients there. So based on your research, why are so many doctors leaving the islands, and what policy reforms do you recommend to try and either bring them back or keep them there in the first place?
Well, one of the problems is that Hawaii is short in its medical personnel. In terms of doctors, we have 800 fewer doctors than we need right now, and about 2,200 unfilled vacancies for non-physician jobs like nurses and patient service reps and so forth. And we were ranked by Wallet Hub as the third worst state for practicing medicine. And that's the key to understanding the problem here. Doctors cannot make the kind of living they need to make in Hawaii. We are several islands, 8 major populated islands, and if you don't live on the main island, you can't really make a living as a doctor. And so people on the neighbor islands, as we call them, sometimes have to wait 6 months to see a specialist in their field, or more often than not, fly to the main island. And then here on Oahu, the main island, which has about 80% of the population of the state, the government regulations are such that we ultimately don't have a sufficiently competitive market for medical professionals. Now, what I'm telling you is not unique to medical professionals. I can talk about other industries and other people in different jobs, and it's the same thing. So it all goes back to an over-regulated climate, one that causes the cost of living to rise tremendously, which causes the population base to shrink, which also affects the market to provide for professionals here in Hawaii. I want to say one last thing that is part of the picture. There is kind of like a paradise malaise in Hawaii, where people think in a way that is the direct antithesis of Silicon Valley. And that's aided by a government that tends to promote low-wage sector jobs and ensure that government workers have benefits that incentivize them to simply work for their retirement. In that kind of environment, you don't have innovation promoted. You don't have education pushed to the level it needs to be. And so without that, you just don't have that creative factor that drives economies to produce more and ultimately benefit all people. And that's really what needs to change in Hawaii.
Let's turn to the public employee pension issue. As PRI has documented in its research, California's unfunded public pension obligations stand at nearly $1 trillion if you use a more accurate accounting method. It sounds like Hawaii is just as bad a public pension problem as we do, and maybe worse if you look at it on a per capita basis. Talk about Hawaii's ongoing public pension problems. How did things get this bad in the Aloha State, and what are the prospects for reform on the horizon? What do you recommend to lawmakers about how to get the pension crisis under control?
Well, basically, we have a problem that you all know all too well in California, and that is unfunded liability of the public pension program. And that is at a huge level. For us, we have $13 billion in debt that we owe our pensioners just for their pensions. And then if you add what we owe them for their health care, it's another $13 billion. That's $26 billion. Now, that's a smaller figure than your trillion in California, but we rank up there with you in the bottom 45th to 48th place nationwide in terms of that unfunded liability burden of Hawaii and California, respectively. Well, why did it happen? Oh, there are a lot of social factors involved here and political factors that are in the history of the rise of unions. Some of it is good, some of it's bad. The good part is it was empowering people who traditionally did not have job protections and so forth. And yet at the same time, it's gone a bit too far. In fact, it's gone very far. Probably technically, the reason we have this problem is because we made promises at the front end we could not keep. We have a program in Hawaii that is called a defined benefit program. In other words, the law sets out what benefits pensioners will have, but doesn't keep in mind or even think about what it's going to cost. So those promises were made a long time ago when the economy was very different. And today, as the economy has changed, we can't afford to pay these levels of benefits that public workers have. Well, the solution is very simple. It is to stop making these promises for pensioners going forward who enter the system now. And I'm pleased to say that Hawaii has modified its level of promises. That takes care of the future a bit. And in terms of the unfunded liabilities we have now, we just have to bite well, I was going to say bite the dust. I don't want to go that far. We just have to knuckle down and have the fortitude with which to say, we're going to stick paying this off without raiding the pension funds as our government has done in the past.
Let's talk about something that you mentioned earlier, and a big issue that affects both California and Hawaii, but our listeners may not be very familiar with, and that's the Jones Act. So could you give us maybe a little background on what is the Jones Act, and how is it, as one economist recently said at a Grassroot Institute event, that the Jones Act, as currently on the books, has the potential to turn Hawaii's economy into the next Puerto Rico?
Well, very few people have actually heard of Senator Jones and the Jones Act that comes to us from 100 years ago in the 1920s. But it basically governs the shipping of any cargo between two American ports. For example, between San Francisco and Los Angeles, or between Los Angeles and Honolulu. If your ship is in that trade, there are four things that have to apply to it. Number one, it has to be built in the United States. Number two, it has to be crewed by a largely American crew. Number three, it has to be flagged as an American vessel. And four, it has to be owned by American companies. Now, the Jones Act has as its most significant feature the fact that it requires ships that are used in trade between American ports to be built in the U.S. Now, that wasn't a problem back in the days before World War II when we were a big shipbuilder. We were one of the largest shipbuilders on earth. But this form of protectionism has actually killed the shipbuilding industry in the United States. As a result, you'd be surprised. We build as a nation less than 1% of all the deep bottom cargo ships in the world. We've gone from being one of the biggest producers of these ships to being one of the smallest. Now, put that together with the requirement that we can only use those ships in that tiny percentage that we build for the trade between American ports. You've got a real problem here. The cost of those ships has skyrocketed. They cost 3 to 5 times more than buying these ships from our allies. And we keep them in service much longer, and so they end up costing more in maintenance. And as a result, the cost of shipping goods to Hawaii from anywhere else is something that is exorbitant. And it also affects California because of the great coastal areas and the shipping in your harbors and so forth. I could go on and on with this, but I'm just going to refer people to our research at grassrootinstitute.org. The bottom line is that it raises cost of living, and the costs raised by the Jones Act are not necessary. We could solve this problem if we simply allowed our shippers to do what the U.S. military does, which is to buy our ships, or many of our ships, from our allies. And if we could do that, we could bring the costs down and introduce more free market competition into the shipping sector.
One thing, if we can continue this conversation about the Jones Act a bit more, is it's actually affecting the shipment of natural gas from our state, California, and the U.S. mainland to Hawaii, and it's making it much more expensive. So you talked a little bit about it in your previous response, but how is this the case, and what reforms do you recommend to lower energy costs for places like Hawaii and Puerto Rico so they can take advantage of the affordable natural gas from the U.S. mainland?
Well, you're right when you say that liquid natural gas is affordable when it's from the U.S. mainland. In fact, it costs about 40% less than buying it from Europe and South America. But we end up buying it from foreign countries because of an incredible problem with the Jones Act. There is not a single ship that is Jones Act authorized that actually can carry liquid natural gas. Can you believe that? We don't have a tanker that is large enough in terms of its capacity nor containerization to be able to handle LNG. And that's why Puerto Rico, although it could save a huge amount of money by buying directly from the United States, import foreign LNG because it's actually cheaper. And they couldn't import enough LNG even if they wanted to. Well, that same thing is true for Hawaii and for major parts of the United States. The answer to this is very simple. As a starting point with regard to Jones Act reform, let's exempt this industry of liquid natural gas. And if we allowed the free flow of liquid natural gas from the United States to our own state, there'd be a huge boost in the economy because of this, and we would be saving quite a bit of money. It's really quite simple to do.
You've also talked a little bit about reforms that could really help the commercial shipbuilding industry, which our listeners may not know is an important industry in San Diego. So what are some of these reforms that you recommend?
Well, it's basically reforming the market. San Diego is a huge center for maritime activity, and it has a history of shipbuilding and so forth. But when we take a look at the broader market, the United States has gone from being a major center for shipbuilding, employing hundreds of thousands of people in the shipyards, and over a 50-year period, we've seen that decimated because of this protectionism of the Jones Act. So we have to get the analysis straight in the first place. Some people say that reforming the Jones Act will result in the loss of union jobs in the shipbuilding industry. That's simply not the case. Failure to reform the Jones Act or putting the Jones Act into place has actually caused the loss of jobs we've seen in the shipbuilding industry in the United States. Compare that to the protectionism we once had in our automotive industry. Many of your listeners will recall a time when you couldn't get a Toyota or a Nissan Honda or other car from Japan or other countries which was more efficient fuel-wise, which cost less and so forth. You couldn't get them cheaply because of the tariffs and things that protected Detroit. And what happened with all those protections? Detroit failed tremendously, and ultimately the city itself went bankrupt. The government had to bail it out. But in the years since that we have removed protectionism, Detroit has built back its automotive industry, and now you can go out and buy a Ford that is competitive with a Honda and at a lower cost. That has brought back jobs into the American automotive industry. But think of the shipbuilding industry in the United States. For over 100 years, we've had the same kind of protectionism and worse than we've had in Detroit with the automotive industry. And it's just gone on and just decimated that industry. So basically, the bottom line is this. The good people of San Diego and other port areas where there has been shipbuilding in California shouldn't buy the argument that reforming the Jones Act will actually hurt them. It will actually help rebuild America's shipbuilding industry. And even if we may be buying ships from overseas to compete with American ships, it will force the industry to improve and become competitive as the automotive industry has, resulting in more jobs. And one last thing, the greater commerce will result in industries such as longshoremen, stevedores, and others who service our shipping to actually be able to hire more people because of the increased traffic that we would have. So it's overall a good thing to reform the Jones Act.
Finally, let's talk a little presidential politics. Hawaii, of course, is the home of one president, Barack Obama, and now another prominent Hawaii resident is running in the Democratic primaries this year, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard. So what's the word on Congresswoman Gabbard from the Aloha State? What should Californians know about her as she seeks this presidency? What do locals think about her motivation is in what, by all accounts, it's a long shot bid for the White House?
Well, any comment I make on this is going to come from my own ignorance or my own personal perspective, because at the Grassroot Institute of Hawaii, we are a nonprofit, non-partisan research organization, so we really don't comment upon these political races. But there is something quite interesting that will give some insight into Tulsi Gabbard and how she is loved in Hawaii, but may not necessarily have the ultimate level of support that one would expect somebody who is a hometown favorite. And that's what you said about Barack Obama. Barack Obama has been loved in Hawaii and is still loved. He's a son of these islands, and his affinity for the islands is well known. He vacations here and so forth. But the Barack Obama Library is not going to be built in Hawaii. Now think about that for a minute. If Hawaii is such an identity for Barack Obama, why are we not building the Barack Obama Library here and building it in Chicago instead? The bottom line answer really has nothing to do with Barack Obama. It has to do with Hawaii's place in terms of influence in the nation. Hawaii is just not a go-to place if you're going to put something that you want to really market to the rest of the nation. Now, with that, I believe that Tulsi Gabbard is a very attractive figure in terms of her intelligence, her energy, her youth, her willingness to challenge her own party. But I don't know if someone who comes from Hawaii at this time will have the gravitas and the political strength with which to really capture what is needed amongst the Democrats for candidacy for president of the United States. Well, I hope that was helpful. And I hope that was non-committal.
But Dr. Akina, I have to say there was another president who came from Arkansas, which we all thought, oh, Arkansas, a little state. That's Bill Clinton's home state.
Well, I certainly wish Tulsi the very best.
So to close things out, we at PRI love nothing more than discussing public policy while enjoying a great adult beverage. So given the long odds that we face as free marketeers in our respective states, it sounds like we could all use a good drink. So what adult or otherwise beverage do you recommend that us Californians try the next time we're visiting Hawaii?
That's a great question. I'm going to throw one out to you, and we don't get any compensation for this plug at all whatsoever. Kaloa rum. Kaloa rum is produced by a gentleman named Bob Gunter. Bob Gunter is one of the business people in the state of Hawaii who's willing to stand up and say, I pay too much for shipping my bottles across the world because of the Jones Act. So when you have a sip of Kaloa rum, you can keep in mind that it'll cost you a lot less if we reform the Jones Act.
Well, we all love Kahlua. Thanks so much for joining us.
Aloha to all of you. Bye-bye.
Special thanks to our guests Keli'i Akina and to Tim Anaya. To read more of the Grassroot Institute's work, go to grassrootinstitute.org. If you're in the Southern California area, join us on November 9th for our Baroness Margaret Thatcher dinner in Newport Beach. Our keynote speaker is entrepreneur and philanthropist Peter Thiel. For more information, go to our website at pacificresearch.org. If you like this episode, please tell your friends and subscribe to PRI's podcast at iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or TuneIn. And please do us a favor and give us 5 stars. You can also listen to our podcast on PRI's YouTube page, youtube.com/PacificResearch1. That's the number 1. Thanks for listening. I'm Rowena Ichon. We hope you'll come back again for next round with PRI.